Impaling somebody with a railroad spike presents a few interesting challenges. The biggest one being, how do you actually get the thing to spin and stick into somebody? Safely, of course. On the practical side of things, it's really helpful to have one of these for shots like this.
Take a deep breath, Jer.
Then of course, it's helpful to have one of these as well for shots like this. But the in-between part is the tricky part. That's where Blender comes in. Okay, so I have my movie clip loaded into Blender here, and the first task is to create a clean plate so we can make this spike look like it's not here for the first few frames, while the digital spike is spinning into the shot. So I'm going to track 4 points in the background, and this is a really nice shot because he moves right out of the way so you can see what is behind him. Now just hitting A to select all 4 markers, going into the solve panel, and under plane track we can click create plane track, but you can just kind of click and drag it over the point where the spike is so that it kind of clears up the whole thing. Now scrolling to a point on the timeline where there's only the background on the clean plate, then inside the track tab under the plane track there's this little drop down that's kind of hard to see, but it says new image from plane marker, and once we click that, it kind of looks like things disappear. That's actually just because it's using the image of the background. Now here I'm just pulling open an image editor and finding the image, which is called plane track by default, and I'm just making sure that I save that to my hard drive. Now, if we scroll back and forth on the timeline, you can see our clean plate will stick, and that's going to be super handy. Next up, I'm just tracking the end of the spike, and this will be helpful for parenting our mask to in a second here. Speaking of which, let's make a mask. You can hit tab to go into masking mode, hit new mask, and over on the side panel, it's pretty handy to be in the mask tab. We're going to use a couple different layers there in a minute. But let's just start out by hitting Control and dragging. I'm going to make a little box around our mask and some of the shirt as well. I'm just hitting Control C to close the loop here, and then selecting everything with A, then shift selecting our track on the spike and hitting Control P to parent it there. Now I'm going to hit Alt S to add a little bit of feathering distance, and just going back into the tracking mode and hitting Alt H to unhide the plane track, just making sure that this doesn't overlap our clean plate at all. And now back in masking mode, I'm just going to hit the plus mark on the masking tab and add in a new layer. I'm calling this subtract because that's what it's going to do. It's going to subtract from our other mask that we've just created. And the idea is to draw a really nice clean line around the jacket so that that stays there. Once I have a pretty good mask going on, I'm going to enable auto keyframes and then just kind of scrub through the footage and make sure that the mask lines up with the jacket at every point. Normally this would be kind of tedious, but there's not really that many frames to work with here, so it goes by pretty quickly. Okay, I'm going to scrub to the point in the timeline where he reacts to the imaginary spike hitting him, and I'm going to put in a marker there with M. Now in the compositing tab, first of all, let's just check use nodes. And at the moment, we don't really have to pay attention to the render nodes. Let's just go Shift A, Input, and Movie Clip. We're also going to want to go Shift A, Input, and Image. And then also Shift A, Deform, and we're going to want the Plane Track Deform node. The input for this node is going to be our movie clip, our camera, and the plane track we're working on. Now when we use the Viewer node on this, it should end up right in the scene where it's supposed to be. Let's add in a Mix node, and then mix our movie clip and this clean plate together. And then going Shift A, Input, and Mask, we're going to drop that mask we created into the factor of the Mix node, and that should temporarily remove the spike for now. I'm also going to add a Blur node to the mask, just to soften it up a little bit so we don't get any really sharp edges. Now I'm noticing this patch is a little bit on the bright side, so I'm going to go Shift A, Color, and get the RGB Curves node, and just drag that down a tiny bit, just so it matches up a little bit better. Okay, dropping in a Color and Alpha Over node. It's finally time to connect up these render layers. Hopping back over to the Layout tab, this is where we're going to work on our 3D scene. Then I'm just hitting 1 on the number pad to go straight onto the side view, and then Control-Alt numpad 0. That aligns our camera to the view. Now with this camera selected, I'm going to load in a background image that's just a freeze frame that I can use to line up the spike, and I can also use this as a texture for the spike later on. Now I'm just dropping in a cube and modeling that into a rough spike shape. Now this really doesn't need to be too detailed because it's going to be very motion blurred. Now in edit mode with everything selected, I'm just going to hit U and project from view. Then I'm going to split the viewport and go into the UV editor just to align the last few pixels of the tip. And with that unwrapped, let's go into the materials, just add new. I'm going to switch that to emission, and in the color, I'm going to set that to image texture, and just going to load in that same background image that we used. Cool, that's looking good. Now I'm going to manipulate the keyframes for the spike a little bit. Since we had auto keyframes enabled, there's already a keyframe for the spike. Let's move that over. And now I'm setting a second position, and that's just going to be out of frame and rotated. That way when the animation is finished, it looks like it's spinning into frame. When I'm done, I'm just going to make sure that I have both keyframes selected and that I'm right-clicking and changing the interpolation mode to be linear. That way it doesn't slow down before it hits him, because that's not really a great look. Before we hop back into compositing, let's set some render settings. I'm going to switch over to cycles and check motion blur, and under film, I'm going to check transparent, and let's just set the samples to something not ridiculous. Okay, so here's the compositing plan. Before the mark that we put on the timeline, we're going to have the patch covering the prop spike and the digital spike spinning in. And after the mark, we're just going to remove both the patch and the digital spike and rely on that practical prop. So here's how we do that. So I'm going to put a mix node in right after the patch and plug the original movie clip into that. That way the factor for this mix node is essentially an on-off switch to make the practical prop appear or disappear. Now on the marked frame, we can hover over that mix factor and hit I to insert a keyframe. And then the frame after that, we set it to 0 and then hit I again. And that's got the animation for our clean plate all covered. Same deal for the render layers. We're going to set that to 1 on the alpha over, the frame of the mark. And then the next frame, set it to 0. Let that practical one take over. Now the digital spike is seeming a bit bright and difficult to see. So I'm going to drop in another RGB curves and just really crank that pretty low so it's pretty dark. And with the motion blur, that reads a lot better. If you're stuck around this long, I have a gift for you, and that's the seamless looping smoke elements. And I find these come in handy very frequently for me. Sometimes I'll have like a flare that needs to be letting off smoke, or like some atmosphere that needs to be a little bit thicker, and they're just super good for adding life to your scene. Oh, and they're free too. So yeah, you can find a link to those in the description. I hope you have an excellent day.